The fields of northern France were heavy with autumn rain, and the earth clung to the boots of men who had marched too far, eaten too little, and slept too seldom. The English army, worn thin by hunger and sickness, dragged itself along muddy tracks. They were not conquerors now, only survivors, chasing the faint hope of reaching Calais in safety. Among them was Thomas, no older than 19, a bow strung across his back. His hands were raw from the damp and his stomach cramped with hunger. Yet, he held tight to the thought that his bow might keep him alive when swords and spears would not. Ahead, scouts brought grim news. The French had gathered, far greater in number, blocking the road. Knights in polished armor, banners snapping proudly in the wind. The trap was set. For the French, the day promised glory. Among them rode Sir Etienne, a knight of noble blood, certain that God himself had delivered the English into their hands. He laughed with his companions, steel glinting on their bodies like sunlight on water. To him, the coming fight was no battle. It was slaughter waiting to unfold. And from the edge of the village of Agincourt, a peasant named Margot watched with wide eyes. She had seen armies pass before, but never this many, never with such thunder in their steps. The fields where her family grew rye were now trampled by horses and men. The earth churned black with mud. She prayed the fighting would pass her by, though deep inside she knew the soil itself would drink blood before nightfall. The armies faced each other across the sodden ground, the mist of early morning clinging low, and all felt the weight of what was to come. The English camp settled into a hushed stillness as night fell. Fires burned low, smoke curling against the damp air. Men huddled beneath threadbare cloaks, sharing crusts of bread, drinking rainwater collected in helmets. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow, but none dared speak of despair. The priests moved among them, whispering prayers, blessing the men with hurried signs of the cross. Thomas sat near the embers, running his fingers along the string of his bow. It was his father's, the wood seasoned and scarred from years of use. He thought of the farm he had left behind in Shropshire, of fields smelling of hay, of his mother's hands warm on his shoulder. Tomorrow he would stand against iron and steel. He prayed his aim would not falter. Across the field, the French made camp with laughter and song. Tents lined with silk, wine poured into goblets, the air rich with roasted meat. Sir Etienne sat with his fellows, boasting of how swiftly the English rabble would fall. "They are starving peasants," he said, lifting his cup. "Tomorrow we scatter them like leaves." His companions roared their agreement, the confidence of men who had never known defeat. Margot, from the shadow of a hedgerow, listened to the French voices drifting across the night. She pressed her child close to her breast, rocking him as if the rhythm could drive away the dread rising in her chest. The ground itself seemed to wait, the damp earth whispering of the bodies it would soon claim. The stars were hidden behind a ceiling of clouds, and the night stretched on heavy and restless. Both armies waited, some in fear, others in arrogance, all bound to the dawn. Dawn crept slow and gray over Agincourt. The fog rolled thick, hugging the wet ground, muffling sound as if the earth itself wished to delay the slaughter. Dew clung to every blade of grass, and the mud sucked at boots with each step. The English rose stiffly from the ground, their limbs aching, their bellies empty. Henry, their king, moved among them with calm resolve. His armor was plain, unadorned, his voice steady as he spoke of honor, of God's will, and of England's cause. To men close to breaking, his words were a lifeline. Thomas knocked an arrow, testing the weight of the shaft. He rubbed the feathers against his cheek, as if drawing strength from the touch. His breath smoked in the cold air, his stomach churning with fear. He heard the whispers among his comrades. "We are too few. We are trapped." But none dared give voice to despair when the king's eyes passed over them. Across the field, the French assembled in glittering ranks. The clatter of armor, the snorting of war horses, the banners unfurling in morning breeze. It was a spectacle of pride. Sir Etienne pulled down the visor of his helm, his confidence unshaken. He looked upon the thin English line and smiled behind the steel. Victory, to him, was already won. From the hedgerows, Margot and other villagers watched the fog shift, revealing the two armies facing one another like wolves before the first bite. She felt her throat tighten. These were not men now, but shadows waiting for blood to wake them. The field lay narrow, hemmed by woods on either side, its soil churned and slick. The stage was set. The morning was cold, but the air trembled with heat yet to come, the heat of war. A hush fell over the English line. The longbowmen planted their sharpened stakes into the soft ground, angled outward to break the charge of horses. The sound of hammering into earth carried faintly through the mist, and then silence again. Silence heavy enough to make hearts pound louder than drums. King Henry gave the order. A horn called out, sharp and thin, and Thomas lifted his bow. The sky filled with the creak of thousands of strings drawn back. For a heartbeat, the men held their breath. Then came the snap, a sound like thunder breaking. Arrows tore into the sky, darkening the pale morning light. They hissed overhead like a storm of steel rain, vanishing into fog and reappearing as they plunged into the French ranks. Horses screamed. Men shouted in shock. Armor rang like bells as shafts struck plate, pierced visors, found the gaps in joints. Etienne, shield raised, felt arrows slam into him, bouncing and skittering off his steel. But around him men toppled, skewered through the eyes, the throat, the armpits. He cursed the English bows, cowards' weapons, but deadly beyond reckoning. From the hedgerow, Margot flinched at the sound, her child crying against her chest. The arrows fell like rain in harvest storm, and she could not see the men beneath them, only hear the cries, the crash of bodies, the thunder of panicked horses. Thomas loosed again and again. His fingers blistered, but he did not stop. Each arrow was a prayer, a plea to live another moment. His fear turned to rhythm. Draw, aim, release. Around him the other archers did the same, until the sky seemed nothing but a black cloud of death. The first charge of the French had been met, not with swords, but with the storm of the longbow. The French knights advanced, banners snapping above their armored heads. Their boots and hooves struck the sodden ground, and the weight of so many pressed the earth into sucking pits of muck. Still, they came on, shields raised, lances lowered, certain their sheer strength would crush the thin English line. But the field betrayed them. Rain had soaked it for days, and now every step was a battle of its own. Horses stumbled. Knights staggered beneath the burden of their heavy plate. The ground clung to them like chains, dragging their pride into the mire. Thomas loosed arrow after arrow, watching the shafts vanish into the mass of steel. He saw horses rear, men fall face first into the sludge, their armor so heavy they could not rise again. His heart hammered, yet with each arrow he felt the strange edge of power. A boy from a farm striking down lords and warriors with nothing but wood and feather. Sir Etienne cursed as the mud pulled at his legs. The weight of his armor, once his glory, now slowed him to a crawl. Around him, comrades sank knee-deep, struggling like men in quicksand. Arrows clattered against him, one piercing the joint at his shoulder, another glancing off his helm. Still, he pressed on, pride and fury driving him forward. The English, he swore, would not leave this field alive. Margot watched from the hedgerow, horror pressing against her ribs. She saw proud knights flailing in the muck like drowning men, their cries muffled by steel. Horses thrashed and fell, trampling riders beneath them. The field had become a swamp of iron, blood, and broken flesh. The clash was not yet hand to hand, but already the French line wavered, slowed and broken by the treacherous ground. And still the arrows fell. At last the French knights crashed into the English line. What had been a wall of arrows turned suddenly into a wall of men, archers dropping their bows to draw hatchets, mallets, knives. Anything that could split armor or pry open a visor. The sound was deafening. Steel slammed against steel, iron teeth gnawed through mail, screams tore through the fog. The French, slowed by mud and weight, fought as if drowning, each swing heavy, each step a struggle. The English, lighter and desperate, darted in like wolves, striking at joints, stabbing into the gaps between plates. Thomas dropped his bow and snatched the short knife from his belt. The first knight he faced was already wounded, arrows jutting from his side. The man lunged clumsily, sword raised, but Thomas slipped aside and drove his blade under the visor. Warm blood sprayed across his hand. The knight collapsed, and Thomas stood trembling, the shock of killing burning in his chest. He had never felt so alive or so afraid. Sir Etienne roared as he swung his long sword, striking down one Englishman, then another. His fury was boundless, yet he felt the drag of exhaustion in every muscle. His horse was gone, cut from beneath him by arrows, and now he fought on foot in sucking mud that clung like chains. Each breath steamed inside his helm. His vision narrowed to slits of iron. From the hedgerow, Margot saw knights swallowed by the press of bodies. It was no dance of honor, no shining duel. It was a butcher's yard. Men fell and vanished into the mud, trampled by comrades, smothered beneath the crush. The field screamed with the voices of the dying, a chorus of agony that would not end. The battle was no longer orderly ranks. It was chaos, raw and merciless. And in that chaos, the tide began to turn. The French vanguard surged, but their own numbers betrayed them. So many knights, crammed into the narrow field, pressed against one another until they could scarcely raise their arms. Those in the rear shoved forward, unaware that the men at the front were already trapped, suffocating in a crush of steel. Etienne felt it, the weight of his comrades pressing in on all sides. His sword arm was pinned, his breath shallow inside the stifling helm. He could hear men screaming not from wounds, but from lack of air, crushed alive beneath their brothers. He roared, trying to push forward, but the mud pulled at his legs and the press behind shoved him deeper into the mire. Pride had brought them here, and pride was now strangling them. The English seized their chance. Archers, nimble without armor, swarmed into the melee with daggers and hammers. They darted between the slow, staggering knights, plunging blades into icelets, smashing down on visors until skulls split. Thomas fought like a man possessed, his knife slick with blood. He no longer thought, he only struck, his ears filled with the hammering of his own heartbeat and the screams all around. From her hidden perch, Margot wept. She had thought knights were gods of war, untouchable, but here they fell like oxen in slaughter. The field was no longer earth. It was a pit of bodies, men clawing, drowning, crushed into mud already thick with blood. She covered her child's eyes, whispering prayers that the boy would never remember this sight. The French had come with glory in their hearts, but now many fought not for honor, not for victory, only for breath. As the first wave of knights sank into the mud, a cry rose from the rear. "Push! Push! Victory is ours!" The French lords, still confident, urged their men forward, sending fresh troops into the quagmire. Horses stumbled, hoofs churned more mud, armor clanged against armor, and the weight of numbers became a nightmare. Thomas, chest heaving, dropped another fallen knight's weapon and grabbed a fallen spear. He darted between the press, jabbing at any exposed gap, his arms trembling with exhaustion. Around him, his fellow archers had joined in the melee, fearless now where once they had been hidden behind stakes and distance. They were young men, villagers, peasants, yet here they were deciding the fate of kings. Sir Etienne, battered and bleeding, tried to rally the second wave. "Forward!" he bellowed, but the mud clung like chains. Horses sank up to their bellies. Men stumbled into their comrades, and the cries of terror grew louder than the cries of triumph. The English pressed the attack from both flanks, striking at wrists, necks, and ankles, exploiting every gap in the once mighty armor. Margot's eyes were wide with horror. The field was no longer a battlefield. It was a living thing, writhing, crushing, drowning in mud and blood. She could hear men calling for God, for mercy, for mothers long dead. And yet, somehow, the English stood. Somehow, the smaller, weaker force fought as one, using cunning and courage against the arrogance of the French. The French pride, once so shining and unyielding, was beginning to crumble under the weight of mud, fear, and relentless English steel. By mid-morning, the field was a nightmare of mud, blood, and broken bodies. The French had pressed forward with all their might, but their advance slowed to a crawl. Horses floundered, knights fell on top of one another, and the air rang with the moans of the trapped. Thomas, soaked to the bone and covered in gore, felt a surge of grim determination. Each arrow had already felled dozens. Each strike of his knife had saved a comrade. The English line held, and now the press of mud worked in their favor. What had seemed impossible, facing thousands with only hundreds, became manageable. Sir Etienne's confidence wavered. He saw men on either side of him fall under the English assault, not from skillful swords, but from the sheer cunning of smaller men who knew the terrain, who struck and vanished before they could be caught. Pride had blinded him. Now fear gnawed at his heart. Margot, still hidden in the hedgerow, shivered as she watched the French ranks break. Knights flailed, disoriented, and men stumbled over their fallen comrades, trapped in the very ground that should have borne them to victory. The English pressed, relentless, exploiting every misstep, every puddle, every sinking horse. A strange clarity came to Thomas. The battle was not just fought with steel or arrows, but with patience, with the cold cunning of men who had nothing to lose but life itself. And slowly, impossibly, the tide began to turn. The French lines shuddered and broke like ice under a hammer. Knights struggled to rise from mud that had become a tomb, and those who managed to stand were cut down from all sides. The weight of armor, once a symbol of power, now became a curse, dragging men into the muck, leaving them helpless before the relentless English. Thomas, chest heaving and hands slick with blood, pressed forward. Around him, archers-turned-fighters moved like shadows, slipping between the larger men, stabbing at visors, breaking shields, striking at ankles and knees. They were small and fast. They were everywhere. Every French knight who fell added to the chaos, and each fall inspired Thomas with a grim, terrible satisfaction. Sir Etienne fought on, but the collapse was undeniable. His voice, once a roar commanding men to advance, now broke into ragged shouts. Comrades vanished beneath the press, their bodies swallowed by mud and armor. The French had expected a swift victory, but they had underestimated the patience and cunning of the few, the skill of the bow, and the weight of the earth itself. Margot could barely watch. She saw men she had thought invincible struggle and fall. Horses lay thrashing, their riders buried beneath them. The cries of the dying were everywhere, blending with the hiss of arrows still falling, the clash of steel, and the roar of men fighting for their lives. She clutched her child, rocking him as though sheer will could shield him from the horror. And through the mud and blood, the English pressed on. Against all odds, the smaller force held, and the battlefield, once a stage of French pride, began to look like a nightmare carved by English hands. The French could no longer hold. Confusion rippled through their ranks like wildfire. Knights floundered, commanders shouted useless orders, and the mud swallowed all attempts at organization. What had been an unstoppable force was now a tangle of struggling men, trapped by their own numbers and weight. King Henry moved among his men, calm and unyielding, a figure of steel in a sea of chaos. His presence steadied the weary, inspired the desperate. "Hold fast," he called. "Fight as one. For England." Every shout was answered with renewed vigor. Men who had been trembling with fear now surged forward, pressing the advantage. Thomas felt a wild surge of hope. He had fought through the arrows, the mud, the crushing weight of knights, and now he saw the French beginning to falter. He drove his dagger into the side of a struggling knight, kicked another in the knee, and ran along the edge of the press, striking where he could. His fear had hardened into furious determination. Sir Etienne, exhausted and bleeding, realized the truth. The battle was lost. Pride and arrogance had brought him here, but only strategy, patience, and the unexpected cunning of the English could save them. He tried to rally what remained of his men, but the mud and chaos swallowed them whole. Retreat was no longer an option. The battlefield itself conspired against them. From the hedgerow, Margot could scarcely believe her eyes. The French, once proud and terrifying, were retreating, stumbling through mud, leaving bodies and weapons behind. The cries of victory from the English rose above the groans of the wounded. She pressed her child close, whispering thanks to God that the tide had turned. The rout had begun, and the smaller English army seized the moment, relentless and merciless. The English pressed forward, not giving the French a moment to regroup. The mud became a grave for men and horses alike. Knights tumbled into each other, their armor dragging them down, and the cries of the dying echoed across the sodden plain. Every step forward revealed another tangle of bodies, blood-soaked and broken. Thomas moved through the chaos like a shadow, heart pounding. Every fallen knight was a victory, but the cost weighed on him. The smell of blood and iron filled his nostrils. The screams of men and animals merged into a deafening chorus. His hands were raw, his body aching. Yet he fought on, driven by the knowledge that turning back was not an option. Sir Etienne had lost all control. His army was shattered, many knights dead, others fleeing or trapped. Mud and carnage had replaced the glory he had envisioned. He swung desperately at any approaching Englishman, but each strike only revealed the futility of his struggle. The field itself seemed to conspire against him. Margot, hidden at the edge of the battle, could only watch in horror. She had seen death before, but never like this. The earth was soaked red, the air thick with the stench of blood and wet leather. Men crawled over the corpses of comrades and horses, desperate to escape the chaos, but few would survive. Her child whimpered against her chest, a soft reminder of life amid the nightmare. By midday, the French were in full retreat, many cut down before they could flee. The English, exhausted but relentless, had turned a battle that seemed impossible into a crushing victory. The field of Agincourt was a landscape of terror, mud, and shattered pride, and the small army of England had stood triumphant against overwhelming odds. When the fighting finally waned, a grim silence fell over the field. The air was thick with smoke, the metallic scent of blood, and the bitter tang of mud. Survivors moved among the fallen, checking the bodies of comrades and enemies alike. Many were too stunned to speak, too exhausted to care. Thomas sank to his knees, shivering, hands covered in gore. His bow lay broken at his side, his knife dulled and stained. He looked at the field and felt a strange mix of awe and horror. The mud was still churned, littered with bodies of men and horses alike, some twisted in ways that made his stomach lurch. He had survived his first battle, but at what cost? Sir Etienne, wounded and humbled, dragged himself from the mire. He had lost friends, honor, and the pride he had carried into the fight. Around him, men whispered prayers for mercy, for the souls of the dead, for the fate that had betrayed them. He would carry this day with him forever, a scar deeper than any sword could cut. Margot stepped cautiously onto the edge of the battlefield. Her village had survived, but the world she knew was shattered. She looked upon the carnage, tears streaking her muddy face. The cries had faded, replaced by the groans of the wounded. She held her child tightly, vowing that they would live, that they would remember the horror but not be consumed by it. The wind shifted, carrying away the smell of blood for a moment, and in that fleeting pause, the English army began to gather, tending their own wounded, counting their dead, and marveling that they had stood, that they had triumphed against impossible odds. The English army, bloodied and exhausted, stood among the ruin of the field. Victory had been won, but it was not a celebration. Faces were pale, hands trembling, and eyes haunted by the horrors they had witnessed. Each man carried the memory of the fallen, both friend and foe, etched into their hearts. Thomas walked among the dead, his stomach churning at the sight of knights who had seemed invincible now sprawled in mud and blood. He could not rejoice, though his bow arm was steady and his heart beat with the strange pride of survival. He had fought, he had lived, and yet the weight of what he had done pressed upon him. Every arrow loosed, Every knife plunged, lingered in his mind. Sir Etienne limped through the wreckage, helmet dented, visor cracked. Pride was gone, replaced with bitter understanding. He had learned that courage alone could not win a battle, and that arrogance could drown even the greatest armies. He would return home, if he returned at all, marked not by glory, but by the mercy that had spared his life. Margot moved quietly through the aftermath, tending to the few wounded villagers and survivors she could help. The world she knew had shifted irrevocably. The fields of Agincourt would forever bear the memory of blood, mud, and steel, and the cries of men who had once believed themselves untouchable. King Henry, standing on a small rise, looked over his weary army. The victory was astounding, improbable, and yet undeniable. Still, he did not celebrate. The cost had been immense. The mud, the blood, the terror. It would not soon leave any man who had fought this day. And yet, against all odds, England had prevailed. The sun was low, weak through clouds heavy with rain, casting a pale light over a battlefield soaked in mud and blood. Silence had returned, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the distant cries of birds circling above. The air still smelled of iron and sweat, a lingering reminder of the day's carnage. Thomas stood atop a small rise, staring at the remnants of the French army. Thousands had fallen, many more wounded, and yet here he was, alive, trembling, and unable to shake the images of men and horses pressed into the mud. His hands shook as he brushed away the blood from his bow, now warped and cracked. He thought of home, of the quiet fields of Shropshire, and wondered how he would ever reconcile that world with this one. Sir Etienne stumbled through the mud, alive but broken. The pride that had carried him into battle was gone, replaced with bitter humility and the understanding that fate could be cruel, even to the mighty. He looked around at the carnage, at the once proud banners now matted with blood and dirt, and felt a sorrow deeper than any wound. Margot, clutching her child, stepped carefully across the churned earth, whispering prayers for all the dead. She had survived, but the shadow of this day would haunt her and her village for years to come. Agincourt would not be forgotten. The cries, the mud, the terror, all would live in memory, and across the field, the English soldiers gathered, weary, wounded, and astonished. Against all odds they had endured. The small army of England, exhausted and hungry, had stood against overwhelming numbers and triumphed. They would speak of this day for generations, not only for the skill of their bows or the weight of their courage, but for the strange, terrible fate that had turned mud and blood into victory. The Battle of Agincourt had ended. The echoes of arrows, screams, and shattered pride would linger forever, a testament to the courage of the few, the folly of the many, and the cruel, unpredictable hand-o.